The blue economy has the potential to create wealth and economic growth and to transform the lives of African citizens. Africa is endowed with an abundance of water resources. Most governments have focused their socio-economic and environmental development on the exploitation of on-land resources, such as forests and minerals. However, there is increasing realization that water resources are fundamental and can catalyze socio-economic development. But the realization of the full potential of the blue economy requires the effective inclusion of all societal groups, especially women, young people, and local communities who live and utilize these resources the most. In this session of In Focus, we have Dr. David Obura, Founding Director of CORDIO East Africa. Dr. Obura works at the boundary between science and action, working to integrate conservation and development through inclusive blue economy principles and links provided by global sustainability goals and targets. So Dr. Obura, tell us, what is the blue economy and why is it important for us to discuss this concept?
Well, the blue economy it's a new term, but to be honest, perhaps an old concept. It basically is how we make a living, how we run our economic activities off the sea and use ocean resources in economic development. Of course, there are many components of the ocean economy or blue economy that don't depend on nature, so shipping, mining, and things like that. But of course, they can have an impact on the ocean itself. But there are many aspects that do depend on natural ecosystems and ocean ecosystems, so fisheries, tourism, a lot of coastal protection from coral reefs and mangroves depends on the health of those systems. So the term blue economy has really arisen in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's from really trying to address sustainable development, making sure that we are in making or in generating wealth from the sea, we're not damaging it at the same time.
So what is the link between the blue economy and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda?
Well, I would say, and I've done some work on this and looking at it, is they're basically the same. The blue economy is basically implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, but based on ocean economic sectors, so fishing and tourism and coastal assets and things like that. And I think a perspective that's really useful for the SDGs is that, so there are 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals relate to nature and natural ecosystems. So number 15 is about life on land, and number 14 is life in the ocean. So that's all the things that I deal with as an ecologist. But really the blue economy is how we can take a perspective from this ocean goal, number 14, looking at all the other goals. So 1 is on income and no poverty. Number 2 is on food security. So how does the ocean support these other goals in achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda?
So Dr. Obura, how can we ensure sustainability and inclusivity within the blue economy?
It's very hard to do, of course. I think there are a few things that you really need to ensure sustainability. One is you need a lot of knowledge. You need science and information. You need to know, how healthy are the ecosystems, how much are you catching, or how much fish are you catching, what's the status of the stock, and things like that. So you need to have information. Scientific information is critical, but also so is local knowledge, local information about, how people undertake their activities and their understanding of the systems. And you need to have monitoring of data so that you can track the health of these systems. So that's really important. But all that information is useless almost if you don't have good governance. And I think the key thing that's necessary for sustainability and inclusivity is good governance. And I think that's something, so we work a lot at the regional level. All East African countries are really struggling and really working hard to bring in place better governance standards and principles, particularly around inclusion and equity. There's a lot of The coastal zone is home to a lot of very low-income communities and families living off the sea and living off the farms adjacent to the coast. And they really need to be supported through this blue economic development. And their livelihoods really need to be front and center as priorities for the local and national governments.
What opportunities are there for economic empowerment of communities, especially women and youth, within the blue economy?
So to be honest, in East Africa, we use very little of what's in the sea in terms of as food sources or for other purposes. So there's a lot of resources that can be exploited. I think in Mozambique, for example, the communities, as you go to the south towards Maputo, communities eat a lot more diverse seafood, so shells, and things like that we don't eat in Kenya and Tanzania, really. So there's a lot of new opportunities if people open their minds and look and see what's being used elsewhere. So we can learn a lot from what's happening in other countries. I think there's increasing support networks in local government. So for example, in counties in Kenya to really promote opportunities for women and for youth through community groups and self-help groups and things like that. So I think really making the most of those opportunities is very important. But the thing is, we have to really have a sense of, who can access what and how do we really help valorize that resource so it does derive an income for people, and in their utilization of that resource, they're not damaging the resource so that they undermine their own income in coming years.
And so, Dr. Obura, are there any legal and policy frameworks in place already to promote women and youth within the blue economy?
Perhaps not yet, actually, because it's still very, very new. There's very little specific blue economy legislation that has been passed. There are new institutions around promoting the blue economy in the countries of the region. But in general, in general laws, in Kenya, we have gender requirements for public bodies or for governance groups, whether it's parliament or the committees in the beach management units, so that really organize fishing activities on the ground. They have to have 30% representation of genders, so 30% women in this case. So there are support frameworks like that that are generic. I think that really do help. And then, of course, there's a lot around supporting youth education and training for youth. But really identifying what specific opportunities are in the blue economy is a challenge, and developing the right training materials. But I think it takes a long time for policies and legislation to come in place that are really what's needed. But civil society works quite quickly, and there's a lot of civil society networks and associations that are coming together to identify blue economy opportunities, and particularly to focus on women and youth in terms of their engagement and involvement.
Dr. Obura, we have looked at different players within the blue economy, but one very important player is the private sector. What incentives does the private sector have in order for them to participate and be one of the key drivers of the blue economy?
Oh, yeah. So like every economic sector, the government is there to regulate it and organize it, but it's really the private sector that does the work, does the business. It's entrepreneurs and business owners who really set up new businesses and start things up. So the private sector is critical. Without the private sector, there would be no blue economy. It would just be sort of government departments doing their thing. So the private sector needs to understand the landscape that they're working in. So you mentioned incentives, so that they need to be encouraged to enter into the blue economy. There needs to be enabling frameworks for investment. If there's too many regulations or too many permits that are difficult to get, of course, that'll stop them from investing. If it's unclear what the regulatory environment or the tax system will be in 5 or 10 years, that will stop them from investing as well. So I think it's really important for the government to understand what the private sector will need for different opportunities in the blue economy, and put in place the incentives for the private sector to play an active role and do what they do. But I think it's really critical that we say the blue economy, we use sustainable and inclusive when we mention blue economy. And the key challenge with the private sector is one, that it tends not to be sustainable because people tend to maximize profit as quickly as they can. And for any sector that depends on nature, that tends to degrade the natural system that provides that wealth. So it might be okay for the business owner because they can make enough money doing that. And then when it collapses and they move on to something else. But then that impacts everybody else who may depend on that system for something else. And then the other thing that the private sector doesn't do well, unless the regulations and the incentives are there, is to be inclusive, because people want to make money for themselves. And the more you hand out, part of your profits, or you pay higher costs or wages to people, to others in society, that reduces the profit margin. So it's critical that this inclusivity is really built into the blue economy through government regulations in ways that make it a win-win situation for everybody. So, so that the disadvantaged groups can play a role, their interests are not harmed by private sector development. The private sector may make slightly less profit, but then the harmony and the goodwill that is engendered by everybody being okay in a local area means that there's less crime. They have to spend less money on repairing cars because the problems with the roads and things like that. So it's really, it's a sustainable development. It's really about getting the policies in place so private sector can function efficiently and invest and make some money, but then lifts everybody at the same time rather than lifting some people.
So, Dr. Obura, you've spoken a lot about what is needed at the national level. However, a unique opportunity presents itself in the regional and global processes to develop internationally binding treaties. How can we as Africans and as a region use these platforms to push the blue economy agenda forward?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So the ocean happens at regional scales. Part of the reason that we as an organization study coral reefs in East Africa is that if we only studied coral reefs in Kenya, then we'd only get part of the picture because of the movement of ocean currents, and they carry the juveniles of species up and down the coasts. They carry pollution, the warming temperatures in the ocean caused by climate change. Those sort of pools of hot water get moved around by the currents. We really have to organize the blue economy and ocean sectors at regional scales, and the scale that really matters for the particular area. In this case, Eastern Africa makes a lot of sense, from the Somali coast down to South Africa and out to Seychelles and Reunion, Mauritius. That's really a very logical system. We have a regional seas convention that's administered through UNEP, so that's in UN Environment Program, that has had a lot of interest from the countries. The challenge is that it's an environmental convention, whereas a lot of the blue economy sectors, of course, are in business sectors, and the economic communities in Africa, the regional economic communities, don't really have an ocean focus. So we really need to get alignment between the East African community, SADC, the Southern African Development Community, COMESA. They all have somewhat overlapping country membership, but the ocean is one, and they really need to work out how to work together to support and promote the blue economy in the countries of the region. So strengthening those links is essential. It's very complicated, regulating the ocean. The country boundaries go out 200 nautical miles into the sea. So how do you police that space? If you have boats fishing out there, how do you make sure you know who they are, what country they come from, if they're landing their catch, within your national ports, or taking the fish and landing it somewhere else? So there's immense challenges to doing all of that, and the information monitoring is very complex.
So then what would you advise for the upcoming UN Oceans Conference series, which we believe Kenya is co-hosting with Portugal, and also the high-level panel on the oceans? What will be your advice for all of us, especially us in the region?
Well, I mean, for all of us, I think with those conferences and initiatives is to really follow them and understand what their potential is and really encourage the countries to invest in them and really use them to our advantage to engage. So, countries, political systems will only do that if the populace and the voters want them to, and also they see advantages in it. But I think it's been the Ocean Conference in Portugal. It's a great opportunity for Kenya, Kenya being a co-hosting country, building on the first conference was in 2017 in New York. And Kenya has taken quite a leadership role in ocean matters like that, with a Sustainable Blue Economy Conference a few years ago in Nairobi. Our head of state is also on the high-level panel on oceans that you mentioned. So these conference series and the high-level panel, in a way, they are slightly informal opportunities for countries to work out how to move forward with the blue economy and run it. There's a very formal legalistic process in the treaties, in the law of the sea, that's being renegotiated. But it's very hard for countries to step outside the bounds of what can happen in those. So these conferences this year, conference in Portugal, the high-level panel work, really give countries a chance to step out into the ocean and see what they can do and cooperate, particularly at regional levels. So I think Kenya has taken a leadership role in both of those, but there are two other countries in the high-level panel on oceans from Africa. There's very strong interest in East Africa, so from Tanzania as well, from Seychelles, from Mozambique, South Africa, in the blue economy. We can really use these conferences and high-level opportunities to push the agenda forward within the region and then support development within each country as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree fully. That would be extremely interesting and relevant for us. I mean, here in Tanzania with Zanzibar, we have a newly formulated ministry for blue economy and fisheries. So yes, so that's definitely something, that a space within which, as a country, we should look to engage more in. So that's great. Dr. Obura, at the beginning, when you were introducing yourself, you spoke also of the link between the work that you're doing and also the blue economy and climate change. And so how can African governments use the blue economy to meet their objectives under the Paris Climate Change Agreement and thereby contribute to reduce the effects of climate change on the continent? So maybe if you can first explain a little bit of the link between the blue economy and climate change, and then how governments can contribute by engaging in this.
So yes, thank you. That's quite a complex question. So, I mean, like any economic sector, climate change is happening. We've set that in motion as a global community with carbon emissions, and it impacts on every economic sector, particularly those that are dependent on ecosystems and natural systems for their productivity and production, like fisheries, tourism for healthy coral reefs, and so on. So the blue economy is really impacted by climate change. And what climate change means is that because it's changing, we're less certain about what the future will be like. As I mentioned earlier, the private sector and investors need, they want certainty. They want to know, if I put in this money now, within 20 years, I can make such and such a return. So climate change undermines their ability to do that, and it undermines livelihoods and so on. So it really stresses the blue economy. Another thing is, now the ocean is very important in climate dynamics. The ocean absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so it really reduces how much warming we experience on land. But the carbon dioxide has an impact in the ocean by making it more acidic. Plus, the ocean is also heating up itself, just like the atmosphere is. So the degree to which the ocean buffers or mitigates climate change is important in the blue economy, because some of the actions we might do in the ocean might undermine its ability to provide that function. So if we damage certain ecosystems or pollute the ocean so the plankton don't are not as productive as they would be, or if we damage mangroves and seagrass beds, they they don't trap carbon the way they can, so there'll be more carbon in the atmosphere. So there's a real back and forth and many interlinkages between blue economic sectors and climate change.
And so, Dr. Obura, what can we as Africans learn about the Conference of Parties last year and the upcoming Conference of Parties this year, which will be held in Egypt? How can we use this platform?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting area. I was lucky enough to go to the Glasgow COP last year. I was part of a team of African scientists, ocean scientists, and science policy writers, and we prepared some policy briefs, and we were able to go to the COP to support our countries, and I was on the Kenyan delegation. So it was very instructive. I'm usually in the academic research community and the non-government side. But this time I was really in the Kenyan delegation, and it was incredible to see all of the behind the scenes negotiations and considerations that happen. And I must say the African delegations that I saw were really, really good. I mean, many working from very high levels of constraints, not very many people in the delegations, a lot of different topics to deal with. And that really affected the ocean discussion for Africa in a way that I think was unfortunate, because oceans are coming up as a new issue in the climate convention. At the previous COP in Madrid, it was the blue COP. So there was an ocean climate agenda or theme came up. Now, among African countries, there was no consensus on what to do about this. And many, of course, were very concerned that this is a new topic. We don't have the scientists or the technicians. We don't have the policymakers that understand these issues. So we're going to resist it. We don't want it. It's coming from the West. It's coming from other countries. Why do they want it? It's got to be bad for us. And I think we really have to turn that around, particularly with the next COP coming up in Egypt. So it's on our own continent. And we are one of the continents that can benefit the most from the blue economy, because we have the lowest overall income levels globally. We have, we're going to have the largest populations, in 30, 40, 50 years time. Most, children, more than 50% will be born in Africa.
So Dr. Obura, maybe if you can also explain the link with the biodiversity COP. How do these also relate with the blue economy?
Yes, certainly. And in fact, I'm much more at home with the biodiversity COP because I've worked in those processes as an ecologist or a biologist for longer. And I'm also very much involved in the discussions. So because of the COVID pandemic, the COP that we were supposed to have in 2020 never happened. And it's been postponed several times. And now we hope it'll happen in August, September in China. So paradoxically, this has given us, 2 additional years to prepare, to think through. So what are the key issues? Now, Africa is one of the continents that is most dependent on biodiversity. The largest proportion of farmers that depend on rain-fed agriculture, people that harvest, what they eat from the environments and the ecosystems around them. We also have a very strong history in East Africa and Southern Africa of tourism, protected areas, and we have this sense in our countries that biodiversity is wildlife, and wildlife is in protected areas, and protected areas are for tourists. Exactly. And we need to really understand that that is just one small part of what biodiversity is, and the biodiversity convention really is also, it has 3 objectives. One is on conservation, and there's big focus on protected areas and species, but another objective is on sustainable use by people, by farmers, by fishers, by forest dwellers, by pastoralists. And then the equitable sharing of benefits from nature is the third one. And so we, as African countries, we really need to push that agenda to shift the focus in the convention. We need to conserve biodiversity in nature because we depend on it in almost everything that we do. But we need to, in a highly populated and warming planet, we need to really understand how we depend on it and to make sure that benefits are flowing to the people that.
Great, Dr. Obura, thank you so much. So then what would be your overall final words, thoughts, and advice to all of us as an African continent? What would you say to us?
Well, I think it's very true for the blue economy. It's a new frontier, and we need new frontiers. Our landscapes are very heavily populated, and the resources are very heavily used. There's a lot of encroachment of people moving out into natural areas. So the ocean and the blue economy are a new frontier of opportunity, and we really have to work out how to do it right. Because if we undermine those ecosystems as well, then we'll only make things a lot harder in 40 or 50 years for our grandchildren, our children and grandchildren. So we really need to put in place the right governance. We have to be inclusive. We have to make sure that, just profit isn't the only driver of the private sector and of investment and things like that. So we have to be brave, I think, and it's exciting. I think we have a lot of youth who are calling for that sort of thing and really looking for new opportunities. And so we have to work out how to do it right. And the blue economy is one of those mechanisms that can help.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Obura. This has been very insightful, very informative. You've managed to put the concept of the blue economy from the very local level, how it affects our local communities, to the national level, what's needed to be placed in terms of governance, but also you've elevated it up now to some of these regional and global processes that we also need to be engaged in, and especially as a continent, and more so for us here as a region. And I think you rightly pointed to the power of the regional bodies and how we could then align and make sure that our voice is one in terms of accessing these regional and global spaces to ensure that the blue economy truly works for all of us as a continent, and that the benefits really stream down right down to the local level to the people who utilize these resources the most. So thank you for sharing your time. Thank you for bringing your expertise and your vast experiences and some of the good practices that you've shared and the examples from the region. And we hope that we continue to collaborate and work with you going forward as Uongozi Institute and yourself and all the work and the organizations that you're affiliated with. So we're very thankful and grateful, Dr. Obura. Thank you very much. Asante sana, as we say it here, and you know that in Kenya. So asante sana.